Trita, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Good, good. Last time we had a conversation, it was a bit bleak. We were talking about 60 or 70% likelihood that the war in Iran will continue in December. I hope things change now in your mind that we have peace in Gaza. But let's start with the peace deal itself. What's your initial reaction?
Well, my initial reactions is that it is extremely, extremely positive if this can hold, and particularly if it translates to not just an end to the genocide, but actually not just a ceasefire, an end to the genocide, but also actually a deal that settles the root cause of these conflicts, which is the fact that the Israeli occupation has been continuing for decades. That needs to be addressed. The Palestinian state needs to be established. We are far away from there, but I think part of the reason why you're seeing so much optimism, perhaps to a certain extent theatrical optimism, is because everyone in the region wants to continue to encourage Trump to do two things that he's done here. A, he's put his own name on this, and he's really taken charge of the issue, which is critical. And secondly, he's been putting pressure on Israel to get to this point. Those are the two things that to a large extent have been missing, or completely missing during the Biden years. He would not put any pressure on Israel. And then earlier on, the Trump administration did put pressure on Israel to get the first ceasefire, but did not sustain that pressure. And I think having his name on this, and he's even said it, I don't think people or countries are going to dare to challenge it because this is my deal, is something that everyone is essentially counting on as the imperfect, but nevertheless the best guarantee that currently exists that this will be more sustainable.
Yeah, did you see the clip of him being asked, I think he was asked to comment on something came out of Israel, probably someone's being skeptical about the deal or whether the war's over. And he said, the war's over. Do you understand? The war's over. He was on Air Force One when he said that just a few hours ago. So yes, and I think you're absolutely right. This is a very important factor that differentiates this deal, one of the factors that differentiates this deal from others. Trump's name is on there, and he wants to be seen as a peace president. And, you know, we have 200 troops in Gaza. I think we've gone a long way, and all the hostages have been released, making it harder for Israel to justify continuing the war. So puts Gaza, puts Palestinians in a good position, and Israelis that don't want war in a good position. Now, there is skepticism, though. I'll mention two comments made from both sides. So we saw the comments from Smotrich talking about how phase two is essentially, some people took it out of context, like phase two is not going to happen, but he was essentially saying phase two won't happen because Hamas will not give up their weapons. That was, the context of what he was saying. And, there's a statement that was made today by Osama Hamdan, who's one of the leaders of Hamas. And he said, Hamas, quote, will not hand over its weapons before the liberation and establishment of the state, referring to the Palestinian state, and according to the source, encompassing Palestine and Israel, which goes back to the original doctrine of Hamas. I was shocked to read that comment. Now, I'm not saying this is the stance of Hamas. I'll tell you why. And he continues saying, and that weapons would remain for self-defense post-liberation. He also affirmed that Hamas leaders abroad plan to return to Gaza and rejected any expulsion of Palestinians. Now, this is what he stated. You've got Khalil al-Haya, who's the lead negotiator. He said the countdown to renewed attacks has begun, citing Hamas's rearmament and recruitment efforts, which is also not that optimistic. And lastly, we have Mohammad Nazal, who's another Hamas leader. He essentially said that Hamas will hand over, and Bassem Naim, they said that Hamas will hand over their weapons to a new Palestinian state. They will not get rid of their weapons. They will hand it over to a Palestinian state, which is, again, more optimistic. But we are seeing that rift between Hamas. And we know Hamas has different organizations, pretty decentralized. You got the political arm, the military arm, and you've got the Al-Shura Council, which kind of oversees matters. It's a pretty complex structure. So my question to you is, first, is there enough willingness from both sides for peace? And number two, is there one decision maker or one group of decision makers in Hamas, or is it really scattered right now?
So first of all, these are crucial questions. And to your first question, I think we have long been in a situation in which the political willingness on both sides have been completely insufficient to be able to bring about a solution. And as a result, the parties needed to be forced to make a solution. This has been the case for quite some time. And the only entity that could do this was the United States, in combination with some pressure from the rest of the international community. To expect that the two parties, just simply out of their own willingness, particularly mindful of the tremendous disparity in power between the Israelis and the Palestinians would be able to break the deadlock was just completely unrealistic. So I think we have to understand that in both cases, there will be statements made by individuals, many of them in a complete position to be able to sabotage this. But that is precisely why sustained pressure on all sides is going to be absolutely necessary in order to get this done. If it was so simple that they all had their own self-interest to go along with this without being pressured into it, then we would have had a solution a long time ago. It's precisely because that isn't the case that there's going to be a need for pressure from the outside. And this goes both to the Israelis and to the Palestinians. On the question of disarmament, I think we also have to be very clear about one thing. After the essential genocide that the Israelis have committed in Gaza, it is completely unrealistic to expect that the Palestinians are going to give up all their arms, but there's not going to be anything done to prevent the Israelis from going into Palestine, into Gaza or the West Bank and commit the kind of atrocities that they've committed. So there has to be some balance in this. And I think precisely the idea that Hamas has to give up its arm, but it's giving up its arm to a Palestinian state, to a Palestinian authority that has the same right to be able to be armed for the purpose of self-defense as Israel and everyone else has. That's where I think we have to get to. And it's going to be a tricky thing, of course, because of the infighting within the Palestinians, the different centers of power inside of Hamas itself, their skepticism, etc. It is not to say that, that's a headache for another day. That day is coming on to us rather soon, of course, but it is not going to be a scenario in which just Hamas completely gives up its weapons. The Israelis do nothing to balance that, and we expect that type of situation will be able to.
We've got a predicament. But we've got a predicament.
Certainly. This is part of the reason I think it's very careful not to be so over-optimistic as Trump is trying to be by overselling this. Because without addressing some of these core issues, and the core issue of Hamas having weapons goes back to, is there still an occupation or not? Has not been addressed. Even the contours of how that would be addressed is not yet in the plan.
Yeah, I'll tell you what the predicament that I'm thinking about is that if Hamas expects the military to exist within Gaza, you've got the West Bank, which has been more peaceful than Gaza, and they don't have their own military. That's the West Bank. Would you imagine Israel allowing, and I think it's part of the 20-point plan, that there is going to be a disarmament of Gaza, and there hasn't been any talk, de-radicalization of Gaza, but there was no talks of an army being there. And I think Israel is going to be pretty adamant that no military capability should be present in Gaza. And if Hamas is adamant that there should be a military within Gaza, and that's who they're going to hand over their weapons to, doesn't matter who makes the decisions, who runs that military, I don't think Israel will accept that.
Well, I think at the end of the day, if you have a two-state solution and you want both sides to be secure, you cannot have security if one side has all the weapons, despite the fact that it's committed a genocide, and the other side has none. So that's just not a realistic solution at the end of the day. And I understand what you're saying, that the Israelis are going to be very disinclined to accept something like that. But unless you have a Palestinian entity that also can defend itself, you're not going to have a viable state. Now, that's not to say that Hamas should have those weapons, of course. And I think, some elements in Hamas are saying they'll give up the weapons, but they'll give it to a Palestinian authority that can defend Palestine in case they are attacked. Now, of course, we have to be very clear. Israel's overwhelming firepower is still so significant that even if the Palestinians have a limited amount of capability for self-defense, that is not in and of itself some sort of an existential threat to Israel. We have to move away from the paradigm in which the only way for Israel to be secure is for it to have total security and everyone else have no security at all. That's just not going to work.
I want to ask you a question on what led to this deal. And there's two sides to this. What I believe in, and that's Trump twisting Netanyahu's arm. And I'll read a quote by Aaron David Miller from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he's not a big fan of Trump. And he said the following, quote, "There is no precedent, none, zero, for an American president lecturing an Israeli prime minister to accept a plan. It has never happened." And, you link that to that famous photo of the phone on, I think it was Trump's lap, and Netanyahu calling the Qatari prime minister with notes. And this is definitely not something that's happened before. So is it Trump being a good negotiator and pressuring Netanyahu? Or the other argument I was listening to today, which I don't really agree with, but I want to get your thoughts, and that's that Trump, the reason peace worked is that because Trump unequivocally backed Israel even more than Biden, who was, it's a fair point. Biden was pressuring Israel a bit more initially, at least in the public eye, and that backing, that unconditional backing to Israel and the threats made to Hamas put Hamas in a corner, forcing them to accept a peace deal. So, do you think that Trump twisted Netanyahu's arm, or pressured Hamas to such a level that they had no choice but to accept a peace deal, or somewhere in the middle?
I fundamentally reject the second explanation. This is actually exactly what the Biden people said as a justification for their bear hug strategy with the Israelis early on, immediately after October 7th. They just gave the Israelis everything they wanted. And they said that the bear hug strategy, by giving the Israelis everything in terms of support that they demanded, would give the United States leverage that it could later on cash in order to pressure the Israelis into a deal. That moment apparently never arrived during the Biden administration, and you saw 4 UN Security Council resolutions calling for the release of the hostages, nevertheless being vetoed by the Biden administration. Also, it is erroneous in my view, because it assumes that in order for the United States to have leverage with Israel, you need to first give them unconditional support. The United States has given the Israelis tremendous amount of support. In fact, Aaron Miller in his quote points this out, that there's just no precedent of an American president lecturing the Israeli prime minister, which is perhaps a key reason as to why we have had such a failure in America's approach towards this for the last 30, 40 years, because we were never willing to give that pressure. Instead, we were all pursuing various variations and degrees of that bear hug strategy, and it's been an absolute disaster for the region and for the United States itself. What I think happened here is that you had a trigger. The trigger was Israel's overreach by targeting Qatar. That really tremendously backfired. It changed the debate inside of the administration, and it fed into something that already had been happening, which is that on the American right, in the America First constituency, Israel's numbers have been plummeting, particularly in the last couple of months. And you've seen more and more voices coming out being very critical of this, not out of a position of compassion with the Palestinians necessarily, but out of a compassion for the idea that America should not be led by Israel, and that Israel's interests should not come ahead and take precedent over America's interests. A lot of people in the America First constituents were also very frustrated because they were fearing that Israel once again would drag the US into another war in the region, that this was damaging America's standing, and that it was taking so much of Trump's bandwidth and was never ending, so that he would not have enough bandwidth to address the many domestic political priorities that constituency has. And this was just bubbling up and reaching such a level that it became clear to Trump that Israel's continued warfare was starting to become a political negative for Trump himself. And unless something happened that changed the trajectory of this, then he would go down to a certain extent with Netanyahu, particularly as midterm elections are coming up. What helped trigger things and actually get Trump to move is the overreach by the Israelis by attacking Qatar, and the rather united front that several countries in the region presented to Trump in pressuring him. And I think that really shifted things, and he realized he needs to put pressure not just on the Israelis, on everyone, but also on the Israelis. And I think the Israelis really strong-armed, not just into that apology to the Qataris. And incidentally, as you know, Netanyahu said something publicly about, this wasn't really that or so. And that's when the White House released the image, the picture of him actually reading from those notes. And in the background, you even saw a senior Qatari official sitting in the Oval Office.
Okay, so hold on. Netanyahu rejected that this went on. I missed that part. So he said that he did not apologize to Qatar before the image was released?
Originally, he in Israeli media, he kind of tried to diminish it and try to explain it away. And in response to that, the White House released the image that showed he was actually reading from a set agreed upon apology with a Qatari official sitting in the background in the Oval Office overseeing the whole thing.
What is a bigger obstacle to peace? Hamas not accepting to disarm? Hamas not having one leader to essentially go towards one path, which is peace, and have maybe factions of it or separate organizations, or the Islamic, the Palestinian, I think Islamic Jihad. continue to fight Israel? Because all Israel needs is just a few attacks and they have justification to continue attacking Gaza. That's a big concern. Is that a bigger obstacle, Hamas continuing, or some members of Hamas continuing to attack Israel or not disarming, or Israel finding some sort of loophole to continue the war? Which one concerns you more?
I think all of those things do concern me, and I will add another thing to it. Sky News just revealed something that many had already suspected, and there had been some reporting on it, but apparently they found the receipts that the Israelis had been funding certain radical groups in Gaza that are opposed to Hamas and have affiliation with ISIS, with Daesh. And
they're
that
the ones
we
that
may
killed
also...
they killed the Instagram journalist that was pretty viral. Did you see it? Do you see that
Exactly,
story? He was shot by, which is sad. He was shot after a peace deal was reached.
Yeah.
I forgot the guy's name, but it's such a sad story. He's one of the big influencers that survived the war, and he was shot by Palestinians affiliated to Israel, funded or affiliated or supported by Israel, and also affiliated to ISIS. What a story.
And some Israeli folks close to the US, to the Israeli government, celebrating his killing as well online. So you know, all of these things make it very, very tricky. So this is still a very fragile situation. Again, a key thing that I have seen make a huge difference in similar situations in the past, in which there's been a fear of sabotage attempts from any side, is the American president being extremely firm and determined to not allow that to happen. Let me give you an example. Over the course of US-Iran negotiations, there's always been attempts by the Iranian hardliners to sabotage it. There's been an attempt by the Israelis, some folks on the US side. During the JCPOA, towards the end of it, just weeks before, actually a couple of days before the actual official implementation date were to happen, you had 10 or so American Navy folks from the American Navy accidentally getting into Iranian territorial waters. They got taken by the IRGC. It was a big crisis, but within 16 hours, because of 5 direct conversations between John Kerry and Javad Zarif, they were all released. Nothing big happened. The US side did not use any threatening language. The Iranians abided by it. It could have happened even sooner had it not been for the time difference. And a lot of that was because there was such a strong commitment by the president at the time and on the Iranian side not to allow even the smallest incidents, in this case, it's not a small incident, this was a major incident, to be able to take an advantage of by those who wanted to sabotage things. We need that same discipline sustained in order for this to work. The other side, those who want to sabotage it, have plenty of opportunities, and they may also have time on their side, because it's impossible in the long run to get the United States to stay that laser focused on this issue. But at least for the next 6 months or a year, we really are going to need that to make sure that this is moved into a much more insulated process that is protected from those type of sabotage attempts.
So Netanyahu was facing massive protests before October 7th. He was facing potential impeachment. And many people thought the war was used as a way for him to remain in power. What happens to Netanyahu now that the war is coming to an end?
Well, it remains to be seen. There are going to be elections next year, even if the current government doesn't collapse, in which case, of course, the elections would come sooner. We've seen that Trump's pressure seems to have also forced Smotrich and Ben-Gvir to kind of back down, at least for now. But, you know, there's also another risk, which is that while there may be an end to the fighting in Gaza, there may be an intensified fighting between Israel and Lebanon. There may be other fires that flare up. So I think we should be very, very careful not to think that this has really taken us to a new plateau. This is taking us toward a new plateau. It may reach that plateau. That plateau may be stable, but we're not there yet.
Do you think the likelihood of a war in Lebanon with Hezbollah or a war with Iran has become significantly less likely now that there's peace in Gaza, or it hasn't changed that drastically?
I think in the short term, it has reduced because at the end of the day, the Israelis cannot commit that type of a war against Iran, at least. In Israel, they're already bombing Lebanon right now. But in terms of starting a larger confrontation with Iran, they cannot do so without American involvement, because the US provides so much of the defense of Israel against Iranian missiles. that is not something that can be put in place after the war has started. It needs to be put in place before. So the Israelis, I think at this point, are in a very narrow situation in which their maneuverability towards being able to start that is unlikely. That doesn't mean that the risk or the larger structural situation has changed dramatically. But I think we're faced with new opportunities and developments. All of it, I think, going back to the trigger of the Israeli overreach. That is really the one thing that has dramatically changed the situation. Almost everything else is a derivative of that.
How will the Middle East look like if we see peace in Gaza? What happens to Iran? What happens to the Gulf nations, especially after the Qatar strike? The relationship between the Gulf nations, even Saudi and Qatar, which are not really that friendly, and Iran, potentially. We saw obviously the pact between Saudi and Pakistan. What happens to Lebanon now that we're seeing the disarmament, potential disarmament of Hezbollah? Maybe give us the latest updates on that if you've been keeping track of it. And obviously what happens to the possibility of a two-state solution? I know it's a lot of topics all in one, but I'm trying to see how the new Middle East will look like if this peace deal succeeds.
So let me first say, I think almost all actors in the region, even those who really want this to succeed, are not putting all of their eggs in it. They are putting their eggs in that basket as well as in other baskets. They have to have a plan B. They have to have a plan C in case this does not work out. The issue, of course, is to make sure that you don't overinvest in your plan B so you undermine your plan A. But so I think we have to be very clear. They're not going to all just suddenly shift and invest in this vision because there's enough reason for skepticism. We already addressed a few of them here about its longevity. But if it succeeds, I hope the administration really moves forward with some things that they've been saying. Without having to use the word inclusive, they've been talking about a larger peace agreement that would include Iran and would essentially include everyone. If you move towards the creation of an inclusive security architecture for the region, modeled on ASEAN, modeled on OSCE, I think it has several critical benefits for everyone in the region. First of all, for the Palestinians, I think it would be critical because as part of it, I think the establishment of a Palestinian state is a given. You're not going to have a sustainable security architecture if the occupation continues and that fighting and that conflict is still alive. So that's that. For Israel, I would say this is a huge win as well, because Israel otherwise is on a path towards permanent pariahhood. And you even see Trump hinting at this, talking about how unpopular Israel had become, but now he has shifted it. He even said that to Netanyahu, according to his interview with Fox News. He said that he told Netanyahu, you cannot continue fighting the entire world. And I think in that hinting, the path Israel is on, but also the cost that inflicts on the United States, because it's the country that constantly has to defend Israel. And then, of course, it has something very, very valuable for the United States, which is a core U.S. interest, is to actually reduce its military presence in the region. U.S. is overextended and has overinvested in a region that is no longer strategically vital to the United States. But it is difficult to do the burden shifting if you don't have anything to shift it onto. If the United States plays a helpful role, not a leading role, but a helpful role to establish a security architecture that is inclusive, then you have a better chance of also then being able to exit the region militarily and not be so overextended in the region, which is something that 3-4 American presidents in a row have promised to do. None of them have done it.
Yeah, I appreciate this. Look, I hope we can all be as optimistic as you are. We've seen this develop, seeing developments on a daily basis. And I share a lot of the same concerns that you share. My biggest focus right now is something that you focus mostly on, is what's going to happen with Iran. Last time we discussed, I think you said this last question. You said last time was about a 60% chance we'll see war by December. I think that's the number you gave. What's that number today? A war between Israel and Iran by December?
I've not changed my view on the longer term risk. I think it still is at 60%. I've changed my view on what the immediate risk is. And I think at least for the next 2 weeks, I would say that the risk has definitely gone down. But it all depends on what happens in these next 2 weeks. Remember, the last American attack on Iran was preceded by extremely generous language by Trump about him wanting to have peace and wanted to make sure that Iran was successful again. He's starting to use the same language now. Last time it led to a military attack. So I want to be careful when it comes to the longer term, or it's not even long term, but the next couple of months. But at least in the next 2 or so weeks, I think the risk is reduced.
Understood. Trita, thanks a lot for your time. I appreciate it. We do have Ami that will be joining as well, who would probably disagree with a few of the points that you're making. Ami, how are you, sir?
I'm well. I mean, don't assume, Mario. You never know. Let's hear the voice.
I hope you guys agree. I think you agree on one thing, that it's good news. A peace deal is good news.
A peace deal is obviously always good news. And yeah, look, the truth is that I've become more, not just over this peace deal, but even in the darkness of the aftermath of October 7th, the last 2 years, I've actually been more optimistic than pessimistic overall. I think the strategic moves that we've seen across the region have been, for the most part, positive. Frankly, fueled by Trump's first administration, and I think now pushed by the second administration.
What do you think led to that peace deal? Me and a few guests earlier were, for the last couple of days, trying to understand, especially with the discussion just now with Trita, was it Trump pressuring Netanyahu, as many people in the media would say, or is it Trump's unequivocal support for Israel, essentially forcing Hamas to accept the deal or giving them no choice? Which one do you think played a bigger role?
I think they all played roles, and I think you're missing maybe one of the bigger pieces also is there was a tremendous amount of pressure from the Gulf states as well on Hamas, and additionally, also I don't know what what the blame pie is for this, or the success pie for this. To break it down, I think none of us know really. Another significant factor was that Hamas lost its. Hamas, as a proxy of Iran, lost its financial support for the most part from Iran after the conflict with Israel and the United States. That was a major blow to Hamas continuing this. And they began to realize that we're running out of funds, running out of benefactors. A deal is probably in our interest here.
Do you think Hamas will disarm? Smotrich doesn't think so. Smotrich is essentially saying like they won't disarm and the war will continue. Phase 2 is almost, he didn't say the word illusion, but it's not going to happen. And not because Israel doesn't want it to happen. He was saying that it's not going to happen because he doesn't think Hamas will abide by the peace plan.
Yeah, I don't agree with Smotrich on much, but I think I might agree with him on this. No, I don't think Hamas is going to fully disarm. And also, it's a larger issue about Hamas, right? What is Hamas? How is Hamas represented? Is it an ideology? Is it a political party? Is it a terrorist group? Is it all three? It's probably all three. The larger problem is actually not the Gaza war itself, although it's obviously a significant problem. The larger problem is the ideology of Hamas is imbued, and it has been for years, actually prior to October 7th, throughout the West Bank as well, particularly with the younger people. If there was an election held today, and by the way, this is the same statistic if there's an election held 5 years ago, so it's not based on October 7th. If the election was held in the Palestinian Authority, which has not been held for many, many, many years, the Greens would win, right? That's really, I think, that's the easy money. If you were in DraftKings laying a bet, lay the bet on Hamas versus the PA winning that. So, is this going to end Hamas? I don't think it will. That's, I think, one of the larger problems that Israel has been grappling with when it comes to the end of this conflict is our ending Hamas, because that was one of the initial goals. I didn't think when Netanyahu laid that goal out, I thought he was setting himself up for failure, because it's impossible to stamp them out, right? You can kill all their leadership, and they did a good job killing quite a few of them.
There's almost no one left.
And yeah, it's not going to end Hamas. It's going to continue. It has continued. And it's spreading through the West Bank, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. Like, my worry is that when you kill so many Palestinians, justified or not, that's a whole other debate. The region will be radicalized even further. When you lose a loved one, when you lose a friend, it's very difficult to achieve what Rwanda achieved after their genocide, where people somehow came together and forgave their neighbors. Very hard to achieve that. And there's going to be a lot of hate among those Palestinians. But the first point in the 20-point plan is that Gaza will become de-radicalized, a de-radicalized terror-free zone. How is that even possible? Like, isn't the plan essentially set to fail when you put a requirement for the region to be de-radicalized and terror-free? What is terror-free? If one member of Hamas does not listen to his superiors and goes and shoots Israeli soldiers, is the peace plan over? Does Israel have the right to bomb Palestine again, bomb Gaza again?
I try to be optimistic when I came in here, Mario, and now you're throwing shade over everything. Look, it's a great question. No, it's not going to be really possible in the short or medium term to de-radicalize the Palestinians. And again, this is also before October 7th and the Gaza war. They were becoming more radical and ideologically driven. Again, talking about the support for Hamas. But it's a process, right? It's not an event. It's something you work toward over a period of time. Do I think we're in a better position now to de-radicalize than we were before? I actually do. I think that.
But what is de-radicalize in your view?
It's not a military thing. It's not. You can't accomplish that militarily. It's an ideological thing. It's trying to bring players into the sphere that talk about peace rather than death, right? And that when they sing songs, the songs aren't about from the river to the sea. But hopefully the song is about creating peace and brotherhood among people. It's things like that. I think you have to have the realization, and it cannot come from the United States. It cannot come from Israel. It can only come from within the Palestinian people. They have to make the decision is theirs. It's really not Israel's. The decision is theirs, which is we've had enough of this conflict. It's clearly not gotten us anywhere. It's only gotten us death. We need to try something different here. And I think what the difference is we need to find a way to say, look, we're no longer interested in your destruction, which they still hold, frankly, if we're being honest. If you poll most Palestinians, they want to see the destruction of the state of Israel. And that number goes up with younger people, not down with younger people. That has to be, you have to walk away from that. And once you do, I think they're going to find a partner in Israel who's willing to embrace that and willing to give them more than they thought they were going to get. So, it's not you
including. Would you say it includes a two-state solution in your opinion? Do you think Israel would accept under any circumstances a Palestinian state? Because Netanyahu doesn't think so.
That's what Netanyahu says. Do I believe that to be the truth? No. Do I think Israel would be willing to accept a Palestinian state under certain circumstances? There's no question about it. Of course they are. But the question is under what circumstances, right? So if you're asking me today, is a two-state solution possible today? No, absolutely not. Because who's the partner, right? Who are you dealing with? Who's the government? Can they be trusted? We don't have answers to any of those things. So no, short term, obviously not. But do I think Israel will accept a two-state solution over a period of time? I don't think it has a choice. I think it has to. So yeah, I do think that Israel's willing to accept it. I do think it's possible.
I hope you're right.
Frankly, it's probably going to happen.
Yeah, I'll tell you what worries me. I've said this many times. I understand Israel strikes on Hezbollah, having an enemy on your border. Hezbollah started striking Israel first after October 7th, striking Iran, which is supporting all those proxies, including Hamas, striking Yemen, the Houthis. That's all debatable, and I understand both viewpoints. When it comes to West Bank and Gaza, what concerns me is what their intent is, Israel's intent. Because if a two-state solution was genuinely their intent, they wouldn't sabotage it. And what do I mean by sabotage it? We obviously know that they allowed Qatar to send money to Hamas, which they could have stopped. Now, the argument that Israel makes is this money was aimed at reconstruction, yet Hamas was using it to build those tunnels and build their missiles. And also, to this day, there's militias being funded by Israel that are fighting Hamas. So if Israel doesn't want a two-state solution, and considering the might of Israel and the Israeli military and the Israeli intelligence, I feel like they control what happens in Palestine. Not sure if you mean it, and please feel free to disagree, but I feel like they've just got so much influence. They've got so much money. You can buy anything. They can easily allow money to go to filter through to some groups in Gaza that will commit crimes against Israel, similar to what Hamas committed crimes against Israel, but was allowed funding from Qatar, or Israel asked Qatar to fund it, to essentially sabotage the peace deal for Israel to continue the war in Gaza. This is a concern that a lot of people have, because when I would ask people I know, I'd be like, there's a peace deal. It's been 2 years, there's a peace deal. Finally, we could rejoice. They smile, but they don't celebrate the same way they celebrated the end of the 12-day war in Iran, or I'm sure the way they'll celebrate the war in Ukraine. That is a concern that many people have, and I'll extend that to Lebanon. I spoke to U.S. Envoy Tom Barak, and we had that discussion. a lot of people want Hezbollah to disarm in Lebanon. They want Lebanon. Lebanon's gone through decades of war, but that they're concerned. They're like, we don't mind living side by side with Israel, recognizing Israel. But what we worry is that if Hezbollah disarms, similar to what Palestinians said about Hamas disarming, if Hezbollah disarm, then that allows Israel, makes it a lot easier for Israel to invade more land in Lebanon. So this is a concern a lot of people have, especially after what they've seen over the last few decades in the West Bank and Gaza and the Palestinian territory shrink. So my question is, and I'd love you to respond, I know I spoke to for a while, what do you think is the real intent of the current government, which I know could change next year or earlier if it collapses?
Well, let me a couple of things. First of all, going back to the comment you made about if Hezbollah disarms, that would allow Israel more ability to invade. That's just factually incorrect. Hezbollah disarming will lead to a long and lasting peace with Lebanon. Israel has no desire for Lebanese territory, zero. The only time it has ever invaded Lebanon is when Hezbollah and the Lebanese have attacked Israel and attacked Israeli civilians, and then ultimately pulled back. There's no desire for Lebanese land, to be totally frank. And I think that the day Hezbollah, by the way, look, you mentioned the strikes on Lebanon and Iran and on Yemen. You missed Syria, by the way, which struck Syria.
Of course, yes, of course.
And what have those things led to? They've led to peace in the border. You're seeing for the first time in Syria, we haven't talked enough about Syria. The discussion and dialogue happening between the Syrian government, right, which was considered by many to be a bunch of terrorists, right, Islamic radicals, to have them open up peace dialogue with Israel is unbelievable. It's almost a miracle. I mean, it's something we all should be looking at and lauding. And we have not seen a continuous amount of peace on the northern border in Israel in years, maybe ever, right? It's been almost an entire year where there hasn't been any attacks from Hezbollah onto Israel. And same with Iran. And why is that? Because Israel extended its strategic violence to those places and said, you guys better simmer down. And when they realized that they had no choice, they did. So I think those are all incredibly positive developments, not negative developments. So
I'll tell you what I yeah, sorry, I continue. I'll let you finish on the current government, and then I'll let you know what I agree with and what I disagree with, so you can go back and forth on what you said about Lebanon territory and the successes among the axes of resistance or evil between Syria, Assad regime, and Yemen. But about the intentions of the current Israeli government, I'd love you to expand on that as well.
Look, you have to understand something, that the state of Israel has been dealing with this crisis now for 2 years. It hasn't had the luxury of looking too far beyond that. So when you really, because it's been so difficult to deal with both the diplomatic fallout globally and also strategic issues in Gaza and Iran, don't look at what's been happening now as the way they feel about what the ultimate result will be, because they're honestly not looking that far ahead. They're looking about how do we deal with the strategic issue we have in front of us, i.e. the Gaza war, and dealing with Iran, Yemen, and also dealing with some of the positive things happening in the region. So yeah, don't read too much into how they're dealing with Gaza is into their longer term strategy and how they see a possible peace deal with Palestinians.
I'll tell you where I agree. So I agree with the Israeli success in striking all their enemies on all borders. I also I agree to an extent that Israel's intent is not the same when it comes to Lebanon, for example, or Syria versus the Palestinian territory. They do not want more territory in Syria and Lebanon, obviously debating the Golan Heights and the buffer zone. Yeah, but beyond that, there's no intent to invade more territory. Now, but I also understand there's people that do have that concern, and it's a valid concern. Israel always talks about Hamas's charter as justification for the war and the eradication of Hamas, even before October 7th. And then many people use the Likud charter, talking about Greater Israel, and a lot of the people within the administration, Smotrich, Gvir, talking about Greater Israel or hinting at Greater Israel. So there is truth, or at least there's validation for that concern. And I also know that Israel is not one body, same way as the US, left versus right, etc. Israel has all these different political parties. So maybe a good way to word my question is, what percentage of Israelis, in your opinion now, would like to annex Palestine and Gaza and West Bank?
Okay, first, one thing real quickly. I don't. I mean, I know you're not doing this intentionally, but I don't like the comparison between the Likud charter and the Hamas charter. Right? The Hamas charter is a genocidal charter calling for the murder of Jews. The Likud charter is more of a political. So there's a difference. But I get your point. So again, you can't really look at you can't take a snapshot and say how many people in Israel are ready for a two-state solution today, right? Because the rawness of the war is still there. I think it's better to look at what it was before October 7th, right? I think the number is lower now because look, the emotions are so raw. The deaths we're literally still bringing. We're literally still seeing body bags going back to Israel and dead bodies going back to Israel. So you can't look at it now because that's the way humans are wired. They will change based on the circumstances they find themselves in. And right now, Israel finds herself in a very difficult circumstance. So the number is going to be lower. So I think more people than I don't know what the poll was. Right,
I'm getting the numbers now. Yeah, I'm getting the numbers now. Yeah, before and after October 7th. What it is today, or what it was during prior to October 7th. I'll give you the numbers any second.
Right. But yeah, so I think that's a look. And also keep in mind that Israel has a history of when they think they're able to make peace, to uprooting settlements. Like they always say, settlements are the problem. Settlements, the reason why they have settlements, they'll never be able. It's not true. Now, I'm sure the intent of many of the settlers is to queer a peace deal. I think there's little question about that. Some of the settlers, a lot of the settlers are not ideological, and the vast majority of the settlements are in these blocks that are probably going to stay inside Israel even after a peace deal. There are very few as a percentage that are in those areas that are problematic. But Israel has a history when a deal is made to pull settlements, to literally even at the end of a gun, where they've had to force settlers, and Gaza is a perfect example, when wasn't a peace deal, but Israel walked away from Gaza fully and wholly, right? People forget that. Israel had zero control of Gaza. Zero. Not a single Israeli citizen or soldier
they
were
controlled,
in Gaza.
not in Gaza, but they did control the borders, and that means a lot. They control what
controlled
goes in and out of Gaza.
No, they controlled.
They control the sea, they control the air, they control the land. The tunnels is the only thing they didn't control.
No, of course not. Israel has zero control over the southern border. Zero.
Egypt does, and Egypt listens to what Israel. They've got a good alliance. Egypt doesn't like Hamas, so Egypt wouldn't really supply it. Obviously, this can be debated.
Problem, right? That's a Gaza Egypt problem. That has nothing to do with Israel. Israel has no control over what Egypt does in the southern border. Yes, they control the northern border, and they control the sea that borders Israel.
And the air.
Yeah, of course. And the air, sure. But they had no control over what happened inside Gaza. They didn't have any troops in Gaza. Yet they pulled out completely, and they took out Israeli citizens who had settlements there and brought them out. And by the way, massive protests against that. So Israel has a history of showing that it's willing to do that if it thinks it can create an environment for peace.
Yeah, the numbers are less than I expected. Prior to October 7th, in January 2023, a joint poll by the Tel Aviv University found that 39% of all Israelis, including Jews and Arabs, supported a two-state solution. I think it was like 20-something of the Jews and 60-something of the Arabs. So average 39%, so 40, with 34% support among Israeli Jews. Sorry, 34% among Israeli Jews and more among the Arabs. And then that dropped to 27% of all Israelis, from 39 to 27 after October 7th. So it's about that number today. I think it's settled February 2025.
I'm surprised it was that high October 7th, actually. But you know what? Look, at the end of the day, the polling is really insignificant. Ultimately, it comes down to if there was a real peace deal and Israelis think there's a real partner on the other side that will hold up.
I hope so.
Again, I think that a peace deal would happen.
I think I think it only happens if the government changes. I think it's only, how much influence do you think? So two questions: how much influence do you think the U.S. has over Israel? Because a lot of people debate the amount of influence Israel has over the U.S., which is extraordinary. But how much influence do you think the U.S. has over Israel? And more importantly, how willing do you think Trump is to continue disagreeing with Netanyahu, challenging Netanyahu, to allow his peace deal to last?
So, okay, so the first part of your question, which was the amount of control each has over the other.
Influence,
Influence, yeah. I think zero control, certainly influence. I think you saw, for all the people who talked about the control, and the control and influence are two different things. I'm glad you separated the two, right? But for people who said Israel controls U.S. foreign policy, Israel has so much influence, yeah, that all went to the garbage. We saw that how untrue that was when it came to the Iran deal, right? Under Obama. Israel put all of its eggs in that basket to try to not have that deal happen, and it failed, which showed the limits of the influence that AIPAC.
But it succeeded under Trump to revoke the deal.
No, that was Trump doing that on his own. That was Trump had always wanted to reverse that deal. He thought it was a terrible deal to begin with. Look, let me Realpolitik 101. You have all the influence in the world until the other side doesn't want you to have that influence anymore, and then it all goes away. Yeah, there's a lot of influence because they happen to have a confluence of things that they want to do together. The day that the United States decides that it's not in our best interest to be influenced by Israel, I promise you the influence goes away like that. It's not an issue of Israeli influence. It's an issue of, it happens to be that right now both things are working to each other's favor.
I'd say that, but the lobbying capabilities of Israel, I think you've done an incredible job as a country, and every country tries to do the same, by the way. But I think no country's achieved the amount of lobbying influence, and a lot of members of Congress are talking about it. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, not a member of Congress anymore, but Matt Gaetz and others have spoken about the amount of influence AIPAC has. You know, when you ask politicians, which country would you visit first? Not the UK, it's not Australia, it's not France, it's not Canada, it's Israel. And the list goes on. You've got a lot of US politicians visiting Israel, and the Mossad and the CIA work together. They're like frenemies. There's just all these different stories about how the Israel has successfully influenced US foreign policy. But I don't see this as a bad thing, at least not for Israel. I see this as a bad thing for the US, but this is their problem. Now, obviously, the extremes think Israel controls the US. And I think what happened over the last few days proves we're far from that. Because I don't think Netanyahu really wanted peace. I don't know if you agree with that, but I think Netanyahu personally, to remain in power, and I'd love you to comment on that, what happens to Netanyahu now post-war, didn't want peace. But I also do think that that amount of influence is fractured. There is that split between America first and Israel first, as we've seen. And the polls in the US about Israeli support has dropped drastically, considering the brutality of the war in Gaza. Justified or not, again, separate debate. I find it not to be justified. I don't know what your stance is when I talk about the strikes on Gaza, not Lebanon or Iran. So yeah, that's my comments about the influence. I'd allow you to push back before I ask the next question.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little secret about America first and Israel first. Yeah, it's also Germany first, and Poland first, and the UK first, and Pakistan first.
Oh, because
every country in the world, it's their interest first, right? This is a little secret to forget about. I mean, that's the reality of the situation we live in. Every country puts its own interest before any other interest. It's just the way of the world, and is never going to change. All Trump did was give that a slogan, right? That's all that was, a slogan.
You don't think, just on that point, you don't think some politicians in the US are making decisions that are maybe not in America's best interest, but in Israel's best interest? Because they've got money coming in from AIPAC?
No.
American politicians making, you don't think it's at all? Not even a bit, because if AIPAC donates a big amount of money to them, and one of the policies they request is like, hey, keep the aid going to Israel, then they would continue that aid, not because it's good for the US, which is heavily indebted. They don't have universal health care like Israel does. They would keep that aid going, despite it maybe not benefiting the US as much as it should, just because AIPAC, which is obviously lobbies for the benefit of Israel, instead of not on the behalf of Israel, is donating a lot of money to them. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. And it's just not reality. There's no politician in America that would choose Israel over the United States. Not one. They do it because they understand the effectiveness the relationship has in benefiting the United States. And then
how has it benefited the US?
Well, if you want to talk dollars and cents in terms of the aid, the way the aid is structured is 75% of all the military aid has to be spent in the United States on U.S. Military equipment.
In fact, that applies. Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No.
I was going to say that. So in most other aid, except for Israel, all the aid needs to be spent on U.S. military equipment. Israel is the only one that have an exception of a percentage of their aid to be able to spend it on their domestic military. And a lot of people would argue that the Middle East has been a net loss. A lot of analysts, if they're pro-Israel, anti-Israel, most of the degree it wasn't beneficial to the U.S. The Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, the strikes on Iran and the problems they've had with Iran, the sanctions on Iran getting closer to Russia and China, it distracted the U.S., it indebted the U.S. heavily, whereas the U.S. should have focused on China and obviously Russia. And the same thing could be said about the expansion of NATO in Ukraine and Russia, but that's a different discussion. That's why I just don't see it to be a net positive for the U.S. And I personally see it, and I love that you're pushing back, I personally see it as a very successful Israeli lobbying campaign or lobbying efforts by pro-Israeli groups that worked in Israel's favors at the detriment of the US. But that's also not as strong as some people make it out to be. Some people say Israel controls X, Y, Z. That's just ridiculous. But there is significant influence that, in my opinion, did not work in the interest of the US. I think it's changing a bit now under Trump, but it's still there.
Let me get that. Just finish that first part about the aid. Totally inside baseball, under the weeds. Probably doesn't interest many people, but just so we're clear, I don't know if that's true that 100% of military aid to other countries has to be spent in the U.S., but let's say it is. The reason why the U.S. wants Israel to spend a certain amount of its money outside the U.S. because they don't spend it, they don't buy weapons from Pakistan or Turkey. That's usually for their own R&D, which comes back to help the United States. So, for instance, Israel is the only country in the world, maybe outside of England, but even I'm not sure England is even part of the exception, that's allowed to make changes to the fighter jets it gets. The reason why it does that is Israel is one of the, if not the most innovative country when it comes to military tech, and all of that tech goes back to the United States. Not to get into the weeds, but since you brought it up, there's a reason why they want to spend a certain amount of money outside the U.S. because they're able to develop things that end up benefiting the United States. But going back, I think the U.S.'s involvement in Afghanistan, Iraq had nothing to do with Israel. So I don't know if Israel's influence was a net negative because of that, because they weren't part of that. Part of that process, the process that was made to decide to go there.
No, I didn't imply that Israel is the reason that the U.S. went toward Iraq. Maybe they had some sort of influence, maybe minor, maybe more than minor, but that's not the reason they went to war. What I meant is that general, the foreign policy strategy in the Middle East for the U.S. just did not work out well for the U.S. as a whole, including what's happening in Lebanon and what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Iran.
Yeah, and that's again not because of Israel. It's because the United States had a thought process. And the thought that was you want to call it a neocon thought process. I don't know. That term is out of use and passé. But the idea was we're going to get more involved in the Middle East, and not because it benefits Israel necessarily, although I'm sure it's part of the process of why they did it because they want to benefit their allies. But again, it always comes back to how it benefits the U.S. the most. The thought was, look. The Arabs want what everybody else wants, which is they want money and they want McDonald's and they want to hang and they want to see movies. They want to be like us. They want to be cool kids. And if we allow them to do that, then, in other words, take them from the thumb of dictators, peace is going to break out everywhere, right? It's what Fukuyama said in his book, The End of History. Turns out it's not really what Arabs are interested in. And by the way, little secret between you and me, nobody else is listening. It's not necessarily what even humans want, including America. I think we saw that with COVID, that maybe security ends up being the most fundamental thing humans want as opposed to freedom. But anyways, that was a mistake they made in the Middle East, thinking that, okay, we get rid of the dictators, peace will break out all over. They were wrong. It turns out it's much more complex. The wants and needs of the Arab people were different than what they thought. And that's why it didn't turn out so great then. Now, having said that, look, when your driving force is you understand We want to do, again, it goes back to, I joked before, although it was true, the idea of every country is first, right? Once you know that going in and you look at the Saudis and you say, okay, Saudis, okay, UAE, what do you really want out of life, right? We're not going to tell you what you want. We're asking you what you want. And it turns out they want economic success, right? Shocking. People are looking for financial success in life. And that's when the Saudis and the Qataris, well, less the Qataris, but the UAE, but the other Gulf states said, this is when we think a peace with Israel is in our best interest. I think we're in a better position now, foreign policy wise, in the Middle East than we have been maybe ever, to be honest. I know that's so weird coming off the shadow and coming off the destruction of Gaza, of what happened.
I agree. I agree on this point because the rivalry between Iran and Saudi, Iran has been weakened, so their ambitions have been weakened, their proxies have been weakened. That leads, Iran. There's a lot to criticize Iran for. They've led to this instability in a lot of regions. If Iran didn't do what they did in Syria, other countries are to blame as well. Didn't do what they did in Yemen and Lebanon with Hezbollah. Those countries would probably be better off. If you look at all the countries allied with Iran versus the countries allied with the US and normalized relations with Israel, the ones that normalize relations with Israel are doing, look at Dubai behind me and look at Yemen. That should answer it. Now, I just want to comment as well on the, I verified the information just to make sure it's accurate on, so this is the exception that Israel has. That's what I mean. Israel's just being treated so well by the US. And again, good for them. Any weapons, so whenever there's military aid sent by the US to any country, that military aid has to be spent on the US military and industrial complex, US military companies. Israel does have an exception. Israel is the biggest recipient. The three biggest recipient of aid from the US, other than reconstruction aid, which is Afghanistan, Iraq, and if you put Ukraine aside, number one is obviously Israel. Out of the entire world, a small country.
Egypt, number two.
Number two, exactly. And Jordan, number three. Which that gives me 2 points. The three biggest aid recipients are either Israel or Israel related because they've normalized relations with Israel. That's the three biggest recipients. It's pretty extraordinary. It's not Canada. It's not Latin America that need help. It's not Argentina.
Mario.
And I'll give you.
Look at Egypt and Jordan as Israel related. That's silly. Come on.
No, they've received the aid after they've normalized relations. Yeah, that's when the aid started.
Well, of course, we're not going to give aid to people who are attacking your allies.
Now, all I'm saying is that why those countries inside of Latin American countries, and I'll make my second point. I think you'll agree with that one. I think Egypt and Jordan are an example of why normalizing relations with Israel is the better path. A lot of people would tell me, Mario, Israel wants to invade more territory in Syria, wants to invade more territory in Lebanon. Look what they did in Palestine. Look what they did in the Golan Heights. I'm like, you could be right. I don't think so. I'm an optimistic person when that comes to that. And I look at Jordan and Egypt as an example. Those countries decided to normalize relations with Israel. They decided to accept Israel as a nation, do business with Israel, and they've flourished relative to countries that have not, including Yemen. So that's why I think Lebanon and we're seeing that already develop in Lebanon and Syria, and that's why the leader of Syria, al-Shara, is taking steps to potentially normalize relations with Israel, already seeing that, these talks behind the scenes. So that's why I'm optimistic. And while I criticize Israel for what happened in Gaza, West Bank, and you can see from this discussion, I'm pretty critical of that. I'm not critical of Israel's lobbying influence in the US. I think they've done really well, and other countries should probably learn from Israel. But I'm critical of what happened in West Bank and Gaza, which I have a question for you. But I'm also hopeful and not critical when it comes to what they've done in at least their attacks on Hezbollah recently and their ambitions when it comes, the majority of Israelis' ambitions and the government's ambitions when it comes to Syria and Lebanon. Now, the question I have for you, and I'll leave you can comment on everything I've said, but also I want to get, it's more of a personal question. What's your stance on the war in Gaza? Because I assume, I made an assumption of what your stance is, but I don't know what it is. What are your thoughts on the destruction we saw in Gaza? Because I know war is ugly. Look what happened in Syria. But also war doesn't have to be this brutal and this destructive. Look what happened in Ukraine. Ukraine's been destroyed a lot, but it hasn't been leveled. Okay, some regions have, some cities have, but in general, it hasn't been leveled the way that Gaza has. Buildings being demolished. Even on the day of the peace, a big building was demolished. Are you critical of the way Israel handled the war in Gaza? Or do you think it was precision strikes and obviously the Hamas tunnels being good, and Hamas using civilians as human shields?
So, okay, by the way, to go back just real quickly to people who say that Israel
please.
is expansionist, and then I'll answer the Gaza question. They say that with absolutely no evidence, no proof whatsoever, because since 67, that was the last time Israel took land, and they've only given land back. In fact, they give the majority of land back they took after the 67 war. So the facts are just show the exact opposite. Israel has been the opposite of expansionist. I don't know what that word actually is. Wait, I don't know. But de-expansionist. So yeah, that's just factually untrue.
The expansionists, does that mean they're going to give up Israeli territory for a two-state solution?
I mean, actually, look, not to.
That means pulling out. That means pulling out of the West Bank the settlements.
In a two-state solution, they will pull back. We already know what the two-state solution is going to look like. We already know. The sad thing is that we know what it's going to end up being geographically. Right? They're going to get Gaza. They'll get the vast majority of the West Bank. Israel will keep those big settlement areas right outside around Jerusalem, and Israel will probably give some of it's actually Israel proper over to the Palestinians to make up for that percentage it keeps to the settlements. That's really what the deal is going to look like. And everything now, unfortunately, is bloodshed that could be avoided. Okay, on Gaza. Was there a tremendous amount of destruction? Obviously, right? Whatever it is, 50%, 80%, we don't know the exact number of buildings that were taken down. It's kind of a false analogy with Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine has been brutal, but Ukraine is a much, much larger geographical area, right? If Russia had the opportunity to level all of Ukraine, it would. It just doesn't have the physical ability to do so. Which makes a super interesting point about intent, right? Because the Russians would like to level all of Ukraine, but they can't. Israel, how do we know it doesn't want to level all of Gaza? Because it can't, right? If Israel wanted to, tomorrow, Gaza would be leveled without exception. But it hasn't been.
But they would lose all support internationally, including American support, pretty much instantly. Some people say, if Israel, but I don't know what their intent is. So even though I'm critical of what happened in Gaza, I'm leaning towards the bad intent. Fair. But they're not going to nuke Gaza because then there is no more Israel either. Like Israel will just be sanctioned even by the US if they nuke Gaza. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, fair. But fine. That's fair. But it's not the reason why Israel didn't do it. But I get why you could make the argument. You could take the other side of that. But this has been, I know this is going to sound crazy, okay? I know it, but it's true. And the data proves it out. Understand that Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on planet Earth, right? And that Gaza, the Hamas and the Gazans have taken the use of human shields to a level we've never seen, right? They're trying to put as many of Hamas is trying to put as many of their civilians in harm's way because they want that number to be higher. They want more civilian deaths because it's a propaganda victory for them. Despite that, okay, when armies go to war in the modern history and they fight in urban conflicts, right, in places, again, less dense than Gaza, the numbers that we have from the UN is that 90% of civilians, 90% of the deaths in urban warfare are civilians. 90%. In the Gaza war, we talk about precision attacks. I know people say, how can it be precision? So it's torn down. How do we know? Because depending on your number, and I looked at this number very, very carefully, it's roughly 50% of the people killed are civilians. I know that sounds like an incredibly high number. I get it, of course. Every life is important. Obviously, I believe that, right? But you have to look at data and how war is fought. And that when 50% of civilians are dead versus 90% in a far more dense place, that says a lot about intent to me. It says a lot about intent.
Yeah, on that point, and I'm trying to find the numbers here because I did a debate on whether Israel committed genocide or not. I do know that the ratio of civilian, and it's hard to know the answer of intent or even the casualties is like, you get certain figures from Israel, you get certain figures from the Palestinian authorities or the Hamas authorities. It's hard to know the truth. You also don't know the intent because you're not sitting behind the scenes when the generals are making those decisions, and what the intent is: destroy that building because there's Hamas there, and there's no other way to take out Hamas like a precision strike in Israel. In Iran, let's just level the building because there's surveillance equipment there. That's enough justification. Or let's level the building so we can destroy as much of Gaza as possible, or somewhere in the middle.
To be clear, there's no instance where Israel is saying there's a surveillance equipment. Let's take the whole building down and not give a crap about who's in there.
I didn't say about the who don't give a crap about who's in there. That's debatable. What I'm saying is that I can't know.
Look,
so
you're right. You know what, Mario? That's fair.
But I do. But I'll tell you the figures why I'm critical. Just to give you some figures that I just got sent while we're speaking. So according to
and by the way, before you do that, real quick.
No, please go ahead. Yeah.
I'm not uncritical of Israel, by the way, at all. I think there are a lot of mistakes Israel made. So yeah, I'm critical about a number of things Israel has done when it comes to prosecuting this war. So I'm sorry, just want to make that point clear. But yeah, go please. I'd love to hear you.
Yeah, exactly. And I appreciate you being nuanced about it as well. And I'm trying to be as well. According to UN satellite analysis, 78% of structures are damaged or destroyed. Earlier snapshots in 2025 showed 70%. Now it's up to 78. Gaza City is even worse at 83%. Schools, 77% of schools. 14 of Gaza's 36 hospitals are only partially functional. The list goes on. Now, the civilian to militant or military casualties, it's impossible to know the numbers. They're not good, but they're comparable from the numbers I've seen. If you want to use the Palestinian figures, and I wish I had them with me, they're comparable to Iraq and Afghanistan. So if you're being critical of Israel in Gaza, you got to be critical of what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. But again, it's hard to know. I appreciate you trying to be nuanced, and I actually really enjoyed this conversation, the back and forth that we've had. So I'd love to have more conversations with you on the topic as this continues to develop. Ami, it's been really, really enjoyable, and I like to have those debates, those constructive debates. I appreciate it.
It's my absolute pleasure, Mario. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ami. Thank you, man. Bye-bye.